Here's a little thought experiment for you. Next time you meet someone who claims to be a socialist, ask them what socialism is. Because most people who make that claim don't know, or certainly can't define it. And they'll usually waffle some nonsense about the NHS instead. So let me help clear it up. Modern socialism evolved around the time of the French Revolution, and it was formalised in the early 19th century by theorists like Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, Saint-Simon, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. These theories were given concrete form by Karl Marx and inspired movements like the Chartists and the Fabians. But socialism really came into vogue in the early 20th century. It was embraced by the middle classes, young people, the intelligentsia, and anyone who wanted to consider themselves progressive. And it was also in the early 20th century that these theories were put into practice for the first time, and they were rolled out across the globe. It didn't go very well. In fact, it was an immeasurably disastrous catastrophe. The 20th century was arguably the worst period in human history. And the disaster of the 20th century was entirely the child of socialism. It wrought destruction, suffering, and death across the globe on previously unimaginable levels. It gave us famine, oppression, war, and fatalities on a scale that dwarfed every period that preceded it. Yet here we are, a century after it was put into practice for the first time, and socialism is coming right back into vogue, as popular as it ever was. It's like all that death, totalitarianism, and suffering never even happened. How can this be? How can these lessons fail to have been learned? Well, the return of socialism is based on a number of widely held assumptions. That Scandinavia is socialist, that all those disasters were not real socialism, that healthcare is socialist, and that the likes of Stalin's Russia and Mao's China were communist dictatorships, not socialist states. All of these are widely held opinions today, particularly among young people, yet none of them are even remotely true. After all, as discussed, these positions are usually forwarded by people who have no idea what socialism actually is. So it's important to examine the truth behind these claims. And to start, well, what is socialism? Now that's not a matter for dispute. Socialism is, in practice, the state control of the means of production, distribution and exchange. It's the state control of the market, of the economy, and it's the pooling of resources and their equitable redistribution. It's nothing to do with services. So healthcare is not socialism. And in fact, decent healthcare can only be afforded when supported by a free market capitalist economy. Many young people are under the impression that socialism is just stuff done by the government. But this would make ancient Rome socialist, because the Roman state built the roads, provided an army, supplied water, and a fire brigade. Rome wasn't socialist. And why on earth do so many people trust politicians above private enterprise? Baffling. Anyway, what about Scandinavia? Well, those nations aren't socialist either. There's some government investment in heavy industry, and they have a range of social policies. But prices, goods, and quotas are determined by the market, not the state. The Scandinavian countries are capitalist countries, not socialist ones. They're not defined by their egalitarianism, but by their prosperity. And it's that very prosperity that allows their generous welfare provision. More than this, the Scandinavian states know how counterproductive corporation taxes are, so their taxation relies on high levels of VAT, And that means the greatest tax burden falls on the poorest members of society. Hardly socialist utopias. But if all this is true, then what's communism? Well, communism's closer to socialism than most people realise. Socialism is the state sharing of resources, and communism is a theoretical concept that once socialism has been imposed for long enough, then the need for the state will wither and die, and the state itself will cease to exist. The conditioned populace will simply share resources as second nature. You can't have a communist state, because the definition of communism is the absence of the state. And all the totalitarian states of the 20th century knew it. They called themselves communist parties because that's what they aspire to. But they never achieved the state of communism. And they were quite open about that. They were all very clear that they were not communist. In fact, they didn't believe that they'd achieved full socialism, as vestiges of the market still remained. There's an abundance of evidence that proves this. Let's look at the main players one by one. In 1917, Lenin founded the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and there's probably a clue in the name. In 1920, when speaking to the Youth League 3 years after the revolution that ushered the Bolsheviks into power, Lenin suggested that the generation of those who are now 15 will see a communist society and will itself build that society. He clearly envisaged the process as being some decades in the future, certainly not something that would happen in his lifetime. After Stalin took over the Soviet Union, he began a program of collectivization to bring agriculture under full state control. It resulted in famines that would kill millions. The Politburo fully supported his measures, which they believed would set them on the path to communism. And at the Party Congress in 1934, Molotov declared that their state was one of victorious socialism, but it was still far removed from communism. And in 1932, when Stalin had been quizzed by Lady Astor, he commented that he would keep killing people as long as it was necessary to establish communism. He was still attempting that in 1938, when at the show trials, Vyshinsky declared that, with the great Stalin at our head, we will march as before, onwards and onwards, towards communism. But communism remained elusive, and it stayed on the horizon, ever out of reach. The same is true of China. By 1957, Mao had crushed China's spirit, and he had killed 5 million people. Yet he was just getting started. The Great Leap Forward was his attempt to push China to the next stage. And when he introduced his new system of communes, the Chinese Politburo agreed that it was the best organisational form for the building of socialism and the gradual transition to communism. Mao himself felt that he was nurturing the sprouts of communism and believed that he would hit his target in about a decade. I guess that in about 10 years' time, commodities will be abundant, moral standards will be high. We can start communism with food, clothes and housing. Collective canteens, free food, that's communism. As the Great Leap got underway in 1958, Mao claimed his extra-large communes were the best means of accomplishing the transition from socialism to communism. If suspicions develop regarding this issue, this is completely wrong, and it is right deviation. Zhang Guzhong predicted that they would attain communism by 1963. But in reality, their grandiose schemes were a catastrophic failure, and they led to the deaths of 45 million people in just 4 years. The Cultural Revolution was another attempt to impose communism, this time by altering the hearts and minds of the population. It was another crushing disaster, and it led to millions more deaths. And the Chinese would still be chasing the spectre of communism, ever out of reach, some 2 decades later. When Mao died, it was completely abandoned by his successors. The free market saved China from utter ruin. The same principle was true of Cuba. The usual policies had been implemented, all private businesses appropriated, the land ripped from the peasants and seized by the state. All press and cultural freedoms were crushed. Elections and political rivals pushed aside. But in October 1962, Che Guevara spoke to Cuba's young communists to claim that they would create the perfect society. He, just like Lenin before him, expected communism to arrive in their lifetimes, but not his. And the same is true of Khmer Cambodia, the most extreme example there's ever been. At a gathering in September 1975, the leaders met to discuss progress. All Cambodians had been driven out of the cities into rural communes and deprived of all their possessions. They were dressed identically, the free market and private property had been abolished, and they were dragooned into government building projects. Yet in agreeing the abolition of money, these leaders suggested that the move would propel the state towards genuine communism at a greater pace than either the Soviets or Maoists. And even in 1978, as the horrors of Tool Sleng escalated, prisoners were ordered to sign confessions that they had attempted to prevent the advance towards the construction of a communist state, a state they had still not achieved. As for the idea that all disasters and failures were not real socialism, that same idea was held by all the great brutes of history. And that idea itself was what caused the worst excesses of the socialist regimes. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and all their peers were all absolutely convinced that socialism would work, that it was the ideal system that would produce the perfect society, that a planned economy was much more efficient than the chaotic scramble of the free market. So when they saw socialism failing elsewhere, their only conclusion was that that must have been not real socialism. But with them, it would be different. They would get it right. They would roll out their plans, and they would create a utopia, a nirvana of brotherly love and affection. So when they implemented their schemes, and they collapsed into chaotic failure, as they always must, they only had one explanation. It had to be not real socialism. There must be people in their states who were either not applying socialist principles correctly, or who were deliberately undermining the socialist state. They all then followed the same pattern set by Stalin. He looked at a particular area, he estimated the production figures he expected, and then compared that to the reality. Based on that massive shortfall, he would tell his commissars that they must have 30,000 wreckers and saboteurs. They were to find them and liquidate them. And they, wanting to prove their commitment to socialism, to the party, to the leader, would find 50,000, who would then all be brutally tortured and executed. And that pattern was repeated in every socialist state, all caused by the blithe belief that any failures just must be not real socialism. Of course, that's nonsense, because real socialism is what exists in the real world. Real socialism is what happens when socialist principles are applied in practice. You can't dismiss the results of an experiment as false. The results can't be false. If they diverge, then it's the expectations that were false. So when people talk about real socialism, what they're actually referring to is what's in their heads. But that's imaginary socialism. David Horowitz memorably summed up this phenomenon. He argued that conservatism was an attitude about the lessons of an actual past. By contrast, the attention of progressives was directed towards an imaginary future. The catastrophe of everything progressives believed could not have been more complete. Yet they refused to see it. From university lectures, in their own political journals, and in the op-eds of the prestige press, they dismissed what had actually happened to the revolutionary future as irrelevant to everything they had said and done. It was only actually existing socialism that had failed. Real socialism had not yet been tried, as though there was no connection between the thing they dreamed and the thing their dreams had produced. It's also frequently argued that socialism, or communism, is a good idea. It just doesn't work in practice. But this is also a ludicrous point to make. Because if it was a good idea, then it would work. That's what defines good ideas. Their utility in the real world. And socialism has repeatedly proven that it has little. If you'd like to support this channel, please like, subscribe, and think about buying my books. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they go into topics like this in much greater detail. They're available on the links below. Please do feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.